What's up, U.S. History? Welcome back to my third and final installment for my lecture series on the Vietnam War. So this is part 3. It'll be the last chunk of notes or commentary I'm doing on the Vietnam War that would have any like test or quiz questions that would relate into it. Now, I might go back. I will be kind of shifting gears a little bit, might mention the Vietnam War a little bit more in upcoming videos and hit the late 1960s, early 70s with some notes. But this will be the last one where the primary focus is giving you information on the Vietnam War. And in this one, we're going to kind of wrap it up and go through the final years of the conflict. I've got a lot of key vocab for you, so I'd highly recommend that you have your notes out, as some of this will be on the quiz and on the semester 2 exam. So if you have any handwritten notes, like I've been encouraging people to do all year, you'd want to have those Cold War era notes out. And then this would continue on with any that you might have already taken on the Vietnam War. Okay, Vietnam War part 3. So let me move my face just a little bit here. Okay, key terms for you. This slide is just all vocab stuff for you, key terminology. First one is the generation gap. Now, this, whether you realize it or not, or have heard that phrase before, you're probably familiar with this. Essentially, it's kind of common sense, just what it sounds like. It's the difference in values and kind of perspectives, the way you see the world between the older generation and the younger generation. So this has always existed. I think it's part of the human experience. You could go back 1,000 years ago and look at some old primary sources, and you see like the older generation in charge complaining about how soft and decadent the youth has become. I mean, like literally, you go back to ancient Greece and you can find Greek philosophers complaining about that. So it's always been there. You've probably seen it in your life before, where you're just not always on the same page with your parents or your grandparents. That's the generation gap. Now, I think for most of U.S. history, the way things were progressing, there was always a generation gap, but it wasn't that big between the World War II generation and the World War I generation, say. Both of them felt like, in large part, that going and fighting the war, well, that's your patriotic duty. Once a generation, America just kind of gets into a fight. Kind of that mindset. Well, in the 1960s, the generation gap really starts to widen. So that's a key part of it, that there is a big break between the older kind of World War II crowd and this younger generation that is growing up in the late 50s, 60s, where they really start to question things more. So that big rift, that generation gap really starts to widen throughout the 60s. Next term for you, number 2, the new left. Now, in American politics, it often gets described as a spectrum, the left and the right. The right is typically conservatives and the Republican Party. The left is more liberals in the Democratic Party. So a lot of Democrats back in this era, though, like Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat, and he's the one that escalated the war. There's kind of a rift that starts on the left side of the political spectrum within the Democratic Party. You have old school, kind of more conservative Democrats, and actually it was a lot of the biggest opposition to like the Civil Rights Act and trying to get rid of like Jim Crow laws and discriminatory policies in southern states. The biggest obstacle was Southern Democrats. It was actually Democrats kind of on the left side of the political spectrum that were also very like conservative socially and didn't want to have integration. Okay, that kind of, a lot of people will lose that over time because the American politics is kind of evolved in the last generation or two. Anyway, back in the 1960s, you have the new left. This is a very much more progressive and liberal ideology that kind of grows out of the Democratic Party. So there are different styles of Democrats in the 1960s and 70s. The new left are the very, very liberal ones. And their big goals, and I would list these things off to associate with the new left, because this will be a quiz question for sure. They want to reduce poverty. They want to also reduce racism, try to get rid of that. And they're big on ending the Vietnam War. This is an unjust war. It has to end. So those are the big policy goals of the new left. All right. And then final one for you on this slide is conscientious objector. Kind of a big fancy sounding word. That's a fancy way of saying a conscientious objector would be somebody that like didn't want to go fight in the Vietnam War, And it wasn't maybe necessarily because they're scared or something like that, but it's that they object to the war on moral and ethical grounds, that they think it's an unjust war. I have no beef with the Vietnamese people. I don't care what kind of government they have, that it's unethical. Okay, now some people, of course, they might call him like a draft dodger, because a lot of conscientious objectors do dodge the draft, and that's their reasoning for it. And then some draft dodgers, or people that didn't, and you know what I mean, left and wouldn't go fight the war. Maybe some did do it because they're scared, but I think a big group actually legitimately were conscientious objectors that thought the war was unjust and they didn't want to have any part in it. All right. All right, now on to student activism. A lot of what is going on with the New Left and the anti-Vietnam, the anti-war movement is led by students. The same is true for like the civil rights movement, which was really kind of peaking out earlier in the decade with Martin Luther King. And, Martin Luther King was not a college student, but a lot of the people that were working closest with them and a lot of the protesters were college students, college age young people. The same is going to be true for the anti-Vietnam movement and the New Left, that a lot of this is centered around student activism, college kids that are becoming politically active. Okay. Kind of a key overarching point right there. Now, a couple other terms for you that I would put in, and all of these I believe will be on the quiz, and a couple of them will even be on the exam. A teach-in, which is kind of a play on words and similar to the sit-in protest. If you remember that, it was a civil rights protest where a black person or black and white people together would go sit at a segregated lunch counter and wait to be served. A teach-in is kind of similar, and it's definitely, they were trying to make that comparison to a sit-in style of like civil disobedience and peaceful protest. This is an optional night class where basically some professors, maybe some veteran that had been over in the war, some student leaders would run this optional night class. And I have a photo here for you where they're doing it under the lights, and they would go over the like kind of the New Left ideology and political things and talk about policy. And specifically, most of these focused on why the Vietnam War was unjust and why it was imperative that we end the war. Okay, that was usually the big focus at most teach-ins. Now, the very first one ever was held at University of Michigan. That might be a quiz question too. The very first teach-in happened 30 minutes away from us, right in Ann Arbor at U of M. It was a huge success, and it spread across the country. And then a couple years down the road, by the end of the 1960s, pretty much every college and university had these teach-in style protests where it was kind of disseminating anti-war information and the whole argument. You know what I mean? Giving you like the tools to go out into the real world and argue against the Vietnam War. Next one is a deferment. Now, a deferment ties into the draft. Key term for you. Definitely write this one in. It's being able to legally opt out of the draft. And you would get a deferment for a variety of reasons, but one that was like most controversial was you could get a deferment if you were enrolled in a college and had decent grades. Now, who was going to college back in the 1960s? Think about it. We were going back, quite a few years here. Today, college loans are easy to get. They're backed by like the federal government. Pretty much anybody with decent grades can go out and take out loans and go to college today. Now, whether you should do that or not, that's a different question, because remember, you can't get rid of that debt. It stays with you until you pay it off or die. All right. But back in the 1960s, there weren't the massive federal student loan programs. So the people that are going to colleges and universities in the 1960s are predominantly wealthy people, upper class families. Most of the poor and like kind of working class kids, they can't afford college. Even if their grades are decent, it was way less common for them to go to a college or university. So this policy kind of creates a situation that the working class and poor people, if their number gets called, they got to go fight in the war. They can't opt out. But the rich kids, a lot of rich kids did get drafted and did go fight and like serve their country honorably, but they had the option because they could get into college and get out of it. So you see that situation where it's like working class poor kids, they gotta go. Rich kids, it's like they can go if they want, but they don't really have to go. Now, you could also get deferments for medical reasons, like something that got brought up by President Donald Trump as like a dig on him. And he's not the only president to to have done this, but he was of fighting age during the Vietnam War, and I guess, and I don't know all the details of it, but apparently he had 5 different deferments, all from his doctor. And some of his political opponents would say, well, he was okay. It was fishy that, you know what I mean? He's a rich guy and he was able to opt out of the war. Now, whether his deferments and medical issues were legit or not, I have no idea. I'll be honest on that. But I do know that he was somebody that got a medical deferment. Those are less controversial, I think, because like if you do have legitimate health problems, well, the military wants fit young men to go out there and be fighting. The last one, and we've mentioned this already, if you watched my infamous images PowerPoint show, I had went over this and gave pictures, but I want you to also know the Kent State Massacre that happened in 1972. So this is kind of on the back end as the Vietnam War is becoming really unpopular by this point, and there's protests happening at colleges across the country. This is the most notorious of any of the college anti-war protests. And remember, every college and university at some point during the Vietnam War had people out picketing and marching and saying in the war. This was the one that's most notable because it turned violent, and 4 American college kids out of the crowd end up getting killed. Essentially, at that one, the National Guard was called in because they were worried that the anti-war protests at Kent State University in Ohio were going to get violent. Apparently, some of the protesters were getting rowdy, and I guess they were throwing bricks and rocks at the National Guard soldiers. The National Guard can get called up and can get deployed to Vietnam. Some of these guys had already been in Vietnam. Some were going to end up going. So you have that rift between soldiers that feel like they're doing their patriotic duty and defending their country, and college kids that think that the war is immoral and it should be ended. And you can see the two sides are not seeing eye to eye. Anyway, some of these younger, not really well trained soldiers in the Guard, I guess, panicked and they fired their rifles just kind of randomly into the crowd, which is not a good idea. And then you have 4 kind of random college kids end up getting killed out of the crowd. So, horrible thing that happened. And then think about it, if you're an average American family and maybe you don't quite know what you think about the war, you're leaning towards like, what are we doing over there? And then you see on the nightly news 4 college kids are killed by soldiers. Oh, it just didn't look good, man. And I think a lot of people felt like, man, what is the country coming to? We're ripping ourselves apart. That it's bad enough that our soldiers are seeing combat and potentially dying over all the way around the world, but now we have violence happening here in the country, right? Next up, now moving into some of the politics from this time. Let me shrink my face up a little more again. I'll try to go through this quick, but Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy was the first president to send some troops into Vietnam, but then he's assassinated. And I guess Kennedy was thinking about withdrawing from the war, but he gets assassinated before, he really had a chance to do much either way on it. Lyndon Johnson comes in and he had escalated the war. His answer to every time anything was going wrong in the conflict was send more soldiers, more manpower, more firepower. And the war just kind of escalates and spirals out of control. Anyway, by the time he is up for re-election and could run for another term, so he is elected on his own after the year after Kennedy is assassinated. He wins that term and is the president, okay, on his own merit now, not just because he had been vice president. He could have run for another term because he had only used 1 year of Kennedy's first term. All right, so he could have legally run for one more term in office. However, he decides not to run, and a big part of it was that the Vietnam War had become so unpopular. I think he saw the writing on the wall. He felt like, man, this has just become a debacle. Chances are, if he had run, he probably wouldn't have gotten it and been elected again because of all the issues going on with Vietnam. So in a lot of ways, Vietnam War is his undoing, and he is a skilled politician. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of his domestic policies and some of the laws he signed in, that affected Americans on the home front in a future PowerPoint. Those are kind of controversial too, but for sure, most people on both sides could say Lyndon Johnson probably didn't do a great job handling the Vietnam War. Now, Bobby Kennedy is also a Democrat, JFK's younger brother. He had been the Attorney General of the United States. He and Lyndon Johnson notoriously don't like each other. They considered themselves political enemies. They personally just didn't like each other either. Bobby Kennedy is before he even knows if Lyndon Johnson's going to run again or not, he said, I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to try to take away the party nomination from Lyndon Johnson. Bobby Kennedy was quite popular. He is maybe not quite as charismatic and good looking as his older brother, John Kennedy, but he's close. You know what I mean? They're in the same family, same ballpark. He's an articulate speaker. I think he's a very thoughtful guy. Many people would say that Bobby Kennedy was actually more the brains of the Kennedy family, and he was more of the bookie, nerdy, like smart one. He is huge on fighting racism, like he's very civil rights, and a staple hallmark thing about his political campaign was he said he was the one candidate that said, if I'm elected, I will end the Vietnam War. So that got him a lot of support. The New Left is behind him, and a lot of other Americans that are just questioning whether this war should keep going on, if it's worth the cost in lives. Anyway, he wins the California primary, the biggest state. He's probably well on his way to being the Democratic nominee for president in 1968. And as he is walking off stage after an acceptance speech, a crazy dude named Sirhan Sirhan, who is mad about the policies that Bobby Kennedy wanted to have over in the Middle East, like around Israel. He walks up and shoots him in the belly, and he dies a few hours later in the hospital. So horrible thing, within 5 years, two of the Kennedy brothers have now been assassinated. And Bobby Kennedy, we don't know. This is in the what if game, but I think it would have been highly plausible, if not likely, that had he not been assassinated, he would have probably been elected. But who knows? I think the general election campaign would have been a tough one because you would have had Bobby Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. Both are very skilled politicians. Now, when Kennedy's assassinated, that leaves the Democratic Party in turmoil. They were probably going to pick Kennedy as their candidate, but now he's gone and he was the one big anti-war candidate. So now you have a bunch of other minor candidates and the sitting president's leaving, and it's chaos, man. And I guess there were huge riots that broke out at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. You can go look up footage of that, but it's a political mess. The Democrats don't have their ducks in a row after that, and Richard Nixon pretty easily wins the presidency in the general election. So Nixon was the guy that had run against JFK in 1960 and lost. He comes out of retirement, runs again, and he pretty easily wins this time. And makes sense because we had been on a couple terms of Democratic presidents, and then a lot of the country feels like we've pushed too far too fast, and we're embroiled in this war that's becoming more unpopular. Things swing back to the other party, which is very typical in American politics. It's a pendulum that swings back and forth, and you can see that all throughout American history. Now, into Nixon a little bit more, and he is an interesting politician. I think on the one hand, he is one of the most skilled kind of witty, intelligent politicians in American history. On the other hand, the flip side of that coin, he did some kind of scandalous stuff and could be a shady guy for a variety of reasons. And this one, I'm not going to get into the downside. And also, he ends up being the only president in American history that had to resign in disgrace. I'm going to get into that whole story somewhere down the road next week. Right now, we're just focusing on his policy in regards to the Vietnam War because that was kind of the biggest issue when he gets elected. Now, he says in many speeches that he caters to the silent majority. That's a good vocab word for you to have. The silent majority is like, I guess if you watch the nightly news back in 1968 and you're seeing anti-war protest after anti-war protest and all this crazy stuff happening, footage from the Vietnam War, you're going to think that the whole country is against the Vietnam War. And man, but that's not necessarily true. It's that the people that hated the war and wanted to end it are the most vocal people. They're the ones that are out there protesting. But a ton of Americans actually supported the war and thought it was a good thing to fight against communist aggression. And, we wanted to keep South Vietnam on our side. However, the people that felt that way weren't out in the streets picketing and protesting and screaming and yelling. They're the silent majority. But actually, statistically, pre-1968, a majority of Americans were kind of supportive of the Vietnam War, and most they had some issues about it, but overall they felt like it's a good fight to stand up against communist aggression and enforce that policy of containment. So the silent majority are average Americans that don't like New Left's tactics. they're too radical and they don't really like the look of these anti-war protests. That's who Nixon wanted to appeal to, and I think he does, and that's why he wins the election. Now, when Nixon comes in, he knows that the Vietnam War is kind of a debacle. He is determined to basically not lose the war. He doesn't want to be the president that that drops the ball on this and officially loses it. He wants to find a way to save face, accomplish our goals, and to basically get out of there and have American boys stop dying. He steps up bombing campaigns. His answer to things, instead of just sending more troops over like Johnson had done, he starts to pull back on our ground troops and he steps up our Air Force campaign to bomb. He tries to bomb the VC, the communist strongholds, back to the Stone Age. So he also does something that's illegal. He starts bombing in Cambodia and Laos, two neighboring countries that American troops were not stationed in. Now, why would you go bomb the neighboring countries? Well, the Viet Cong was very smart, and it's all jungle there. So they would come in and attack American forces, and then they would flee back across the jungle and go across the border and hang out in Cambodia, knowing that American soldiers can't pursue them there and come kill them. So it's like you kind of do hit and run tactics, and then you get out of there and you go back to safety. Well, we realize they're doing that, so Nixon starts bombing them there. Unfortunately, that creates a lot of instability in those two neighboring countries. And then at the end of the war, when we pull out, and that whole region is essentially going to go communist because he kind of destabilizes it. Now, his big policy, the thing that I want you to know and associate with Nixon in regards to Vietnam, is his policy, and his wording for it was Vietnamization. Essentially, to sum that up, was to train South Vietnamese boys, to train these young men from South Vietnam to be soldiers and to fight against the VC and North Vietnamese army, and to pull American troops out. So he was big on our soldiers will train Vietnamese soldiers to do the fighting, and then those Vietnamese soldiers are going to take our place on the ground. Kind of makes sense. I get it, and I think that was a logical strategy to pursue. He has mixed results with it. It isn't super successful, but I do get why you would want to try and attempt to do that. Now, the final slide for you. This is kind of an important one where I give you the results. So America is in the war until 1975. You could put that in. That's the official end date of the Vietnam War, when America withdraws its military from South Vietnam. Shortly thereafter, I don't know the exact time frame, but like within a few months, the North Vietnamese army invades. Now you don't have American air power there bombing them and taking them out. And the South Vietnamese military was not that tough, and we didn't do that great a job, I guess, training it. And it probably wasn't all our fault either. I think there wasn't a lot of motivation from the people that lived there to fight this war either, and the whole country goes communist. So this would be kind of the one war in American history where we did not. It isn't like a clear-cut loss out on the battlefield, but we do not achieve our goals. And remember, our goal was to have an ending that looked kind of like the Korean War, where to this day you still have a communist North Korea, but a free capitalist South Korea. That's what we were trying to do in Vietnam too. And after we leave, doesn't work out. The whole country unifies as a communist regime. Then we had talked the domino theory, where if like one country goes, that's kind of why we got in there in the first place, that all the other neighboring countries, communism would spread to them. It proves to be kind of true and kind of not true. Cambodia and Laos, the next two countries over, also do go communist, but it doesn't spread across the whole region. It doesn't go into like Thailand and Burma and Malaysia. So I guess that was fortunate for us, but I don't know what to say on that other than it's like a few dominoes fell, but not all of them. And then casualty rates to wrap up for the Vietnam War. Put it in perspective, in World War II, a much bigger conflict that had happened a generation before, we lose about 450,000 Americans die in that conflict. I believe in the Korean War, smaller scale conflict that really only had about a year and a half of intense fighting. That was about 37,000 Americans. In Vietnam, approximately 58,000 American soldiers die. If you go on the Washington, D.C. field trip, we'll go to the Vietnam War Memorial, and it's kind of a cool one. It's a big stone, like a marble wall, and they have put on every soldier that died in the war, they have their name engraved on it. So if you had an uncle or a grandpa or somebody that had died in the war, you can actually look up the directory and you could go find their name on it, and you'll see people with a sheet of paper and like a crayon go over it and take the print of their name off of the memorial. Um, 300,000 Americans are injured. A lot of those in traps with mines, things like that, or just shot and, a bullet or take around. So 300,000, many of them are like amputees too, where in a landmine or in some booby trap, they end up losing a leg or a foot. So that's super unfortunate. And then 2,500 POW or MIA. If you've ever seen this flag down here, the black one, POW, MIA, you are not forgotten. The guy in my neighborhood is a Vietnam veteran who flies that flag all the time, and that's about those guys that are prisoners of war or missing in action. And some of them might have been prisoners of war, but we didn't know they were that were missing in action. That becomes a debacle, and a lot of guys do kind of get forgotten about in this conflict that were taken prisoner, and then the America withdraws, and we don't have diplomatic ties because it's a communist nation now, and unfortunately, a lot of Americans were trapped there, these servicemen, for many years later. But I think at this point, we over time had negotiated more with the Vietnamese government, and apparently most of the guys that were still alive and prisoners of war, we have gotten them out of there. We do get them out eventually, but it takes a while. Countless more Vietnamese are injured and killed. So that's the final stat. I don't even have a number for you there. Those would be estimates. They didn't take great data on all that, but you could definitely, I think it would be very realistic to say up in the million plus number of Vietnamese people died in the conflict. Some of those women and children, some of them just innocent bystanders, others that were VC or NVA, but it's devastating to the tiny little country of Vietnam, where made a big impact on the war. And I guess even a generation later, it's not weird to go over there today and to see people that are scarred up from napalm in a bomb, or that have lost an arm, that would be older now, up in their 60s, 70s, but that had something like that happen during the Vietnam War, and it affected them. It scarred them for the rest of their life. All right. So that wraps up the Vietnam War. If you do have any other follow-up questions for me or want to chat about it anymore, give me a holler and I'll get back with you. Yeah.